All right, we're back at it today with a big one, American foreign policy under President Roosevelt, along with his big stick policy. Now, first of all, this is starting us into this progressive era of American presidents. This is a time period in the early 20th century when the progressive era led to a series of domestic reforms in American administration who had an overall goal of improving the lives of Americans. This would lead to the expansion of the role of the U.S. government in most Americans' lives. These presidents were Republican Theodore Roosevelt in the first decade of the 20th century, Republican William Howard Taft, the successor to Roosevelt, and Democrat Woodrow Wilson, elected in 1913. This era would also see the United States take a more expansive role in foreign policies and get involved in more overseas intervention. So, our next couple videos are going to deal with these presidents and their foreign policies. Now, first of all, with Teddy Roosevelt in the Americas. Roosevelt believed that the Americas were a part of the United States sphere of influence. And he believed that the United States was right to impose its will on the Americas through diplomacy and economic policies, but always have the threat of military intervention close behind. Now, this is a time period where the United States is just coming out of the Spanish-American War, and Cuba has gained its independence from Spain. The Cuban population, though, following the revolution in Cuba and the Spanish-American War, faced a devastated economy and infrastructure. The Cuban population had declined by 10%. The sugar production was crushed. There was weak post-independence leadership in Cuba. So all around, a lot of problems for newly independent Cuba. The United States had a temporary occupation of Cuba following the Treaty of Paris, but that Teller Amendment that we've already discussed would prevent annexation. During the occupation, the United States did bring improvements in sanitation and education to Cuba, but also it brought the dominance of American business into Cuba. And we're just going to leave that typo there and pretend it doesn't exist. So, indebted Cuban farmers will often have to sell their lands to American companies, and this will result in the growth of a Cuban American Sugar Company, the United Fruit Company, and Hershey's Chocolate, all American businesses with huge holdings now in Cuba. American companies would also control the supply of natural gas and electricity in Cuba, building rail lines in Cuba. By 1905, American interests owned 60% of Cuban land. So the United States could dominate the Caribbean state without actually owning it or colonizing it. Now, with the coming of an independent Cuba comes a new Cuban constitution that was drafted with a lot of oversight from the United States. The United States would pass a law in our own country called the Platt Amendment, where the United States would withdraw troops from Cuba following its independence, but allow for the intervention of the United States into Cuban politics if it was necessary for the quote independence of Cuba and to protect life and property on the islands. And now, of course, that property is in many cases owned by American interests. It also called for Cuba to make no foreign alliances without American approval. And it would grant the use of two naval bases in Cuba, including the use of Guantanamo Bay. The United States would intervene with military forces in Cuba on two occasions in 1906 and 1912, following the provisions of the Platt Amendment, in order to, quote, protect Cuban stability. Now, this is going to go hand in hand with Teddy Roosevelt's presidency and what becomes known as his big stick diplomacy. Cuba is going to become a model for the rest of the region that the United States foreign policy can threaten American intervention of Latin American governments while not having to actually control these states. If we ever thought that some state was not effectively governing or handling economic relationships or paying off its debt with the United States would reserve the right to intervene with force. This big diplomacy is going to be employed throughout Latin America. First in the in the Dominican Republic. After the Dominican Republic defaulted on American loans, Theodore Roosevelt moved to control the nation's customs service, and this would be his first application of big stick diplomacy. This is going to evolve the earlier 19th century Monroe Doctrine with what is known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Foreign nations still needed to stay out of the Americas, but the United States reserved the right to intervene for the collection of debts and the insurance of responsible government in the Americas. Essentially, the Roosevelt Corollary turned the United States into an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. Now let's head a little bit to the south into Panama. The United States had long desired a shortcut from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean around the narrow Isthmus of Panama. Panama was a part of Colombia, and previously, French efforts in the region to build a canal had failed. So the United States bought the rights to the canal zone from the French for $40 million. But the Colombian government, who controlled Panama, demanded payment as well. So here's where the United States is going to step in and support local Panamanians in a revolt against Colombia to break from Colombian rule. With American support and intervention, the United States would recognize an independent Panama and control the Panama Canal Zone for a $10 million cost in what is known as the Hay-Bunaveria Act. So then the United States got to building the Panama Canal. Now, this proved to be an incredibly challenging feat. Final cost for the Americans alone, not including what the French had already paid into it, neared $400 million. Since 1881, when construction was first attempted, over 25,000 lives would be lost in the construction of the canal. But upon opening, over 1,000 ships per year would traverse this new canal, and it became the world's most important waterway, or one of the world's most important waterways, almost immediately. Now let's move out of the Americas and head over to Asia. The McKinley and Roosevelt presidencies would bring the United States more involvement with Asia and the other great powers of the world. And the United States, like our counterparts in the United Kingdom, were concerned about a growing Germany that could upset the balance of power in Europe and threaten American interests in Asia. The US supported an open door policy in China that would essentially allow the United States and other European powers into China to freely trade and engage in business, and that China should be open for all foreign states to take advantage. The United States was also supportive of an international force that protected foreign interests during the 1900 Boxer Rebellion in China. Now, with regard to Japan, the United States and Japan had a growing connected relationship. Teddy Roosevelt himself would help bring an end to the Russo-Japanese War that started in 1904 with the negotiations of the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Now, while Japan did gain territory in this war, there was frustration with Roosevelt for not insisting that Russia pay a cost to Japan for the war, what is known as a war indemnity. In 1906, a local issue threatened to blow up into an international crisis as the San Francisco School Board voted to segregate Japanese students from white students. Roosevelt's frustration with his local policy led to an ultimate rescission of the move and a subsequent, quote, gentleman's agreement between the United States and Japan, in which Japan agreed to limit emigration to the United States in return for the United States not having an outright ban on Japanese, as that would be seen as embarrassing, kind of like what the Chinese already faced with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Agreements between Japan and the United States would go even farther beyond this gentleman's agreement. The Root Takahira Agreement would have each country recognize Chinese independence and each would respect each other's possessions. Also, a respect of free trade opportunities for both countries in China. This is all happening at the same time that the United States is taking on an expanding role in the Philippines. The United States annexed the Philippines following the Spanish American War, and that immediately led to a brutal war against Filipino nationalists. Now, the Philippines would remain a colony of the United States until after World War II. At the time, it was deemed that the Filipino people were not ready for independence. Voting in this new colony would be limited to property owners, and fewer than 3% of the property owners in the Philippines would actually be able to vote. 1912 brought a Philippinization policy in the Philippines that did begin to permit some Filipinos a role in their colonial government, but obviously still decades away from having any say in the actual colony. See you next time.